designers need to shift from thinking about the relationship with folks who are experiencing the problem as an extractive one, right? You have information that I need so I can go build this thing, to a relational one.
So today we're joined by Dr. Christine Ortiz. She's a serial entrepreneur with a passion for innovation through equity-centered design. And her current venture is a think and do tank called Equity Meets Design. Welcome, Christine. Thank you so much for speaking with us.
Yeah, thanks. Glad to be here.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. I want to talk about equity design and equity designers. This seems like a good place to start. Can you share with us a little bit, just to kick us off, what do you consider equity design and who are equity designers?
Yeah, so the premise of our work is this really core belief that racism and equity are products of design. And for us, that is the kind of most hopeful way to think about inequity and racism, because if they are products of design, then that means that they can be redesigned. And so our work is really thinking about how we can get folks to think of themselves as designers. So we think that everyone is a designer. We are constantly designing things, creating things, making things, tangible things, right? Whether that's a product or a website or kind of the more traditional ways we think about design, but also lots of intangible things, processes or systems or organizations or cultures or experiences or relationships, right? All of those things we see as being designed. And so we believe that if everyone can see themselves as a designer and then explicitly use an equity-centered design process to design whatever those things are that folks are designing in their day-to-day, then that is how we're going to actually do equity, right? So that's one of the big questions that we kind of came out of trying to answer is, right, like lots of people believe in equity and can talk about equity, but what does it mean to do equity every day? And so that's where equity design and equity designers come in, right? So while we think that everyone is a designer, you have to make a decision to be an equity designer. And then how do you be an equity designer, right? You design equitably. So how do you design equitably? And so, you know, obviously there's a lot more to designing equitably than just having a toolkit and a set of frameworks and mindsets to do that work. But that is one of the things that we think is really helpful to folks to be equity designers, is to have a process and a framework and set of tools that they can use to engage in this design work. And so that is what we've been working on, is really thinking about how do we create a truly equity-centered design process, and then all of the things that come with it so folks can use it in their day-to-day work.
So what are some of the sort of high-level tips, without, you know, you don't need to give away your entire work here, but what are some of the high-level tips for people to insert in that process when they're thinking about, again, not just for designers, but people thinking about all of their work? When they think about their work, what are some of the big high-level ones they need to sort of stop and think about?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of our work is about thinking about the who. So, right, one of the kind of traditional problems in design is that folks who are, you know, capital D designers, trained in design, have a degree in design, right? Largely folks who look a certain way, have a certain background, are given the power and the permission to design for problems that largely they don't experience themselves, for communities that largely they do not live in themselves. And that is just kind of a taken for granted separation, right? The designer is separate from the user. And so a lot of equity design work really goes into thinking very deeply about who is experiencing the problem that's on the table to be solved, and centering those folks in the process. So ceding power to them, involving them in different ways in the process. That may or may not mean that they're on the quote unquote design team, right? Because sometimes that can actually be an additional burden of having to do the work, but really thinking about when and how they are involved in the process, and what decisions and parts of the process are actually ceded to them to make final call on and influence in different ways, in ways that really move past kind of a token or an extractive relationship that we see in kind of traditional human-centered design. So I think really like that real interrogation and thinking about who is involved in what parts of the process and how and what power they have, what decisions are being made, is one of kind of the big things that we focus on. We talk a lot about designing the design process, which every time we say that, we like laugh because it's like so meta and, but it's so important, right? Because one of the other things that we find is that the way that kind of inequity persists is that we're just not intentional and transparent about things. Those things often go together. You can't be transparent about something you're not intentional about. And so really thinking about how are we going to engage in this design work and this creation work and this co-creation work before kind of diving in is really important.
And I just am intrigued by, this point that you make about how everyone is a designer, right? Because I certainly don't think of myself that way, right? And when I think design, I do, it wasn't until reading some of your work that I sort of recognized, oh, right, I do think about it in terms of the capital D, right? Designer. And it does seem to me that, right, it's probably important to those of us who don't think of ourselves that way, but to your point, are designing all the time, right? I think, well, yeah, in my job, I do design processes and I do design, even if I'm not creating some of like our, digital content, I am ultimately informing what it looks like because I'm helping to drive that process or lead that process. So I am curious, just, what would you say to folks like me, who don't think of themselves that way, but now have this awareness, are there ways to kind of reflect on that and identify where are the places where you are designing and how can then you go to this stage that you and Dave were just talking about, right, of thinking about doing that in the most equitable way possible?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is one of the things that we thought was going to be a huge barrier when we started and actually has not been, as far as getting people to think of themselves as designers and their work as design work. Because I think, so first, like we made an intentional decision and we went back and forth on what language to use when we were thinking about this work. And we intentionally wanted to reclaim the words design, designer, because of the power that those words hold, right? There is inherent permission to create, power to create. And we know that if we are trying to create an equitable world, right, that's something that hasn't existed. So we're in the business of creating something that has never existed. And so how do we help people kind of latch on to the power and the agency that they have in contributing to that work? We've actually been kind of pleasantly surprised that people, once we give them kind of the nudge and a little bit of like the permission to try on that like feeling of being a designer, and especially a lowercase d designer, right? Then folks really kind of step into it, and it's really cool to see that happen. And that being said, right, kind of one of the things that we try to do is demystify, de-jargonize, what it means to do design, the kind of steps of the process and the tools and the whatnot, and really start from a place of like, you were already a designer, you were already doing design work. Let's just use our stuff as a lens to look at what you were already doing and see where we can strengthen it towards this goal of equity that we have, versus, right, like here's this whole new set of things or, right, like area of expertise that now you need to like introduce and build capacity in. It's really like, you're already doing this, let's start from there. Now let's just see how we can strengthen that. And yes, maybe you were doing some things that like we totally need to like abandon or rework, etc. It might be more than just tinkering around the edges, but right, like let's not pretend like we haven't all been creating things for a lot of our careers.
I wonder if when you work with people, and they get sort of, I bet you see sometimes in their faces, they get just all jazzed up about what they can do. And then they go back into their environments and it's hard. And they face challenges, barriers, other people who don't see it that way. What do you tell them?
That is one of the reasons that we have decided to work with organizations and not individuals in our work. So we are really focused on systemic change. And in order for systemic change to happen, like whole organizations have to shift the way that they work. And so in our work, we actually target change at the organizational level or institutional level, and then at the team level, and then at the individual level in that priority order, which I think is a little different, right? A lot of like more traditional DI consultants come at it in the opposite way, right? Like working on individuals who will then influence teams, who will then influence organizations. And I don't think it's either or. I think we need to be attacking, right, all of this from both ends. But especially if we're talking about process changes, which at its core, right, like that's what taking an equity design approach is really changing the way the organization does whatever it is that it does, in order for that to take hold, be sustainable, and lead to the kind of changes in output of whatever the organization, right, the work product of the organization. We need those changes to be systemic and institutional. And so because of that, we don't train people, we train and do systems change in organizations. Also because, right, people leave, right, all of these kind of things that we know are issues with knowledge management and sustainability and all of that kind of stuff. So obviously we're training people, but the work that we're doing with them is changing the kind of structures and the culture of the organization in ways that ideally will outlast the people who are currently there. So not totally answer to your question, but that's a huge, it's a huge problem, right? Like, and this is one of the things that we set out to solve, is like people go to a conference or training or whatever it is, have this like magical experience, are all fired up. They go to work the next day and it's like just back to the same old. And so really thinking about what does it take to actually see some change. And so part of that is, right, the kind of, we need critical mass in the organization. And we need that critical mass up and down the power structure, right? So we actually will not work with an organization unless the CEO, executive director, et cetera, is totally on board and is actually my point of contact for this work, right? Not delegated to a committee or to someone.
It's really that's a fantastic view of the struggles of organizational change, but specifically this type of change, especially when you get people enthusiastic about it, to have them be in an environment that's supportive of that. My guess is there's a lot of people watching this are like, wow, I wish I worked at an org like that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think has been really interesting about our work is that, right, like where equity meets design, right? So we've really thought about the intersection of those two fields or lines of work or ways of thinking, but there are also two different motivations for the work, right? So we have folks who enter organizations and individuals that enter, even individuals and enter differently in an organization, of thinking about like, what is the driving force here, right? So is it this like moral, emotional, right, like justice seeking, like DI stuff just like makes sense to me, it matters, like I see it, I see where it's missing, like that needs to be what we do. And then the design piece is more of a like, there are these societal problems, oftentimes social issues, right, that we want to solve, and we're going to use the best tools in order to solve those problems. And while there's some overlap there, right, for some folks, right, it's not the same, they just don't have that same personal, moral, or they haven't yet really fully understood, right, like what racism really looks like and feels like, right, to folks who live that every day. And so what we're saying is like, okay, enter whichever way you want, and enter through the equity door or enter through the design door. Either way, right, like we're going to engage in this work in such a way that we're going to leverage the best of each of those things, and that's the only way that we're going to actually solve these problems, right, which is what these folks care about, the design folks door care about. Or right, like enter for the folks who enter through the equity door, right, like we're going to create something through that has centered this like equity lens. And so, but we also can't do that without doing right the design, fundamentally the design work, right? Like, and this is one of the things that we heard all the time from like traditional DEI experiences, is that like I can, right, like I understand more, I can see more, I can speak more, but like what do I do about it, right? And so that's how we bring these two things together, which I think gives everyone an entry point, regardless of where they are in their own personal journey or how fluent they are in right these concepts or having these conversations.
You have this great tagline that we saw in a lot of your work online, right? That says racism and inequity are products of design and they can be redesigned. So just to kind of bring it to life, I would love to hear you talk a little bit about like what that means. Are there even some examples that you can provide about, okay, what does it mean to actually, undesign or redesign, racism and inequity in any kind of particular place?
So one of our core beliefs of our work is process as product. And so that is really a belief that like we cannot think about equity as a checklist or outcomes or things that we're trying to accomplish. We really think about equity as a verb, and that's actually like as far as you'll get as a like definition of equity from us when we're working with folks. And so we really think about equity as a way of being, of thinking, of making decisions, of being in relationship with people, of creating things, of running your organization, of being a leader, right? Of all of those things. It has to be something that we are living and being every day. And with that, right, that's why we focus on the design process and actually less on the design outcome. Now, our bet, right, is that if the process is equitable, then the thing we design will be equitable or at least be directionally moving right towards increased equity. And oftentimes what we hear from our clients is that as we are facilitating them through an equity design cycle, it's the first time that they have experienced what it can be like to be in a work team where folks feel like they can be their authentic selves, or their experiences are valued, or they can share what they believe without repercussion up and down right power chains, or they can be totally honest about like their lived experience and it'll be taken care of, where they actually can impact the direction right that things go, all of these kinds of things. And so we've been struggling with thinking about like, how do we measure the impact of our work? Like, what does it mean to increase equity? Right. And one of the ways that we've been playing around with that is thinking about power, distribution of power, the use of power, the sharing of power, and thinking about that in relationship to both identity-based sources of power, right? So our society says that people who have lighter skin have more power, or people who are male presenting have more power, or right, like our society gives people power and takes people's power away based on identity. So how can we create environments that counter that, where that is not kind of the way that power is distributed? And also thinking about the difference between power and responsibility and authority, right? So thinking about people's titles and roles and that kind of power structure, and redefining all of that in a way that folks who are most proximate to the problem get to have the power to make decisions about those problems, regardless of these other kind of influences and ways of thinking and distributing power.
I love the point that you're making about power. I mean, everyone on this call probably has heard me say this before, but I often get a little uncomfortable sometimes with a focus from organizations on inclusion and belonging, and those being like the end goals that they're talking about, right? Because one always thinks, well, if people feel included and feel like they belong, that doesn't necessarily tell you anything about their access to opportunity, access to power, development, et cetera. And so I just really like that you're bringing that emphasis to bear. So that was a great answer.
We asked sort of our broad community how they sort of do equity or what they think about. And I wonder what you could share about the results. They spoke up about critical listening, about bias assessments, maybe looking at the technology they have, certainly employing some design thinking, and then obviously hiring practices, both, as you say, the process for hiring, but then who they're hiring. Is that on the right track? And what else would you add to that list?
With organizations, when we tackle like some kind of like hiring or pipeline or retention or whatever question, what we actually, when we get to the root cause of the problem, it's always a culture issue. It's never a technical solution that we land on as the first thing that needs to be implemented. And so the kind of first work that we do with any organization, regardless of how many people of color or whatever other kind of identity markers are missing from that organization, is that even in all white organizations, right, there are not high levels of trust, there are not high levels of right, like all psychological safety, all of the things that we know are necessary for good work to happen and for people to feel good about themselves every day at work, regardless of kind of these other pieces. And so that always ends up being the first thing that we tackle, is like, how do we fix some of these culture things through this lens of equity, which, fixing culture through a lens of equity is so much more than, this cosmetic diversity question that oftentimes we started with.
I'm wondering, what do you think about organizations that are sort of building technology? They have a special obligation in this space, but also special challenges. And I wonder if you have a perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean,
Can we just capture her facial expressions and use that for social? Because I think that's.
This is why I can't play poker.
I think that's great. This will be the title shot for the entire series. So tech organizations have special challenges. Christine be like. But anyway, back to the question. Special challenges for tech organizations, or your perspective on it?
Yeah, I don't think it's special. I think it's amplified, right? I think it's the same problems that our society has been created on. It's capitalism and patriarchy and racism and all of those things. I think it's amplified because of the scale and speed at which technology companies work. And so I think therefore the solution's the same, right? If every tech company decided, right, that they were going to use an intentional equity-centered design process to design both themselves and the products that they ship, it would be fine. But that's not the norm, and that's not what is rewarded, right, by VCs, by funders, by markets, etc. Well, actually, not true. I think we have found that markets do reward this work. It just takes a little massaging to get there.
What you were just saying made me think of a concept that I was reading about in some of your work that I think connects to this. And I was curious to hear you talk a little bit more, because it was a new idea for me, which is this term you use, meta empathy, which I think is related to some of these questions of process and power and agency. So I would just love to hear you kind of explain what that is and why it's important.
Yeah, so we made this decision to start from design thinking as it currently exists, and then put it through all of these like lenses and tools from the DEI space. So put it through critical race theory, put it through identity development frameworks, put it through all of these things, um, and take a critical lens to each piece. And so when we were doing that with this empathy step, right, this empathy step that is really the reason that human-centered design and lean startup and all of these things took off, is because that was a, a kind of revolutionary way to think about it, right? Like we should talk to and uh, and learn from the people who are experiencing this problem that we want to solve, like us as quote unquote experts, however that is, defined, cannot do this without talking to the folks who are actually experiencing the problem and theoretically will use this thing that we're creating to solve this problem with them. And that was right, like a big shift in how people thought about things, and people saw how important and useful it was in getting them closer to a good solution, closer um, to solving the problem. But what we're still finding is that while we've moved closer, we haven't gotten there yet. And so thinking about why that is, and especially right, going back to power is at the core of all inequity, and so that is kind of the first lens that we use to think about things. That whole empathy stage was still premised on this idea that the people who are experiencing the problem are fundamentally different people than the people who are the designers on the design team. And at the end of the day, the power lies with the designers. So the power lies not with people who are experiencing or proximate to the problem. And that fundamental disconnect is right, like where we think a lot of problems lie. And so if we want to shift to a place where the people who are most proximate to the problem have the power in the design cycle, and the design process, then what does that mean for designers? And it means that designers need to shift from thinking about the relationship with folks who are experiencing the problem as an extractive one, right? You have information that I need so I can go build this thing, to a relational one. How can we be in community together, and how can I support you as a designer, right? Like you have lived expertise with the problem, I have expertise from a design perspective. How can we work together to solve this problem? And that requires that the designer does a lot of self work and understanding of who they are, their relationship to the problem, why they're interested in solving that problem, how they feel and interact with the community, that they are entering, if it's not their own, all of that, because right, who we are affects what we design. And so that is at the core of a shift to meta empathy from kind of a traditional empathy lens.
So in addition to your own writing and your own work, what are some resources that folks should look into, whether it's books, other organizations, other people, something you can point listeners toward?
There's a whole group of folks, the Design Justice Network, that have been doing this work for a long time, super into their work. We've also kind of informally created our own little network called the Equity Design Collaborative. And so you can go on the Equity Design Collaborative workshop website. You can go on the Equity Design Collaborative website and see some of the other folks who have been working on creating this space and some tools and frameworks around that. But would love to highlight specifically Antoinette Carroll's work with Creative Reaction Lab, and the work that she's doing creating an equity design framework, and specifically using it with Black and Brown young people to redesign their own communities.
Your own personal lived experience and who you are, and where you've lived and how you've lived your life. How do you bring that, or those experiences? How do you bring those experiences into your work, and how do they influence your work?
Yeah. So one of the things that I have been reflecting a lot on is actually Valerie Kaur's 2016 prayer, in which there's a quote about kind of the darkness of the moment that we're living in. And she was referring to the 2016, right after the election, darkness of the moment that has now spanned 4 years. But she, and I am like getting chills just like thinking about it, but she says, what if the darkness that we're experiencing is not a darkness of a tomb, but the darkness of a womb? And what if what we are doing right now is giving birth to the promise of this country, of this world, right? Of a truly equitable world. And having literally given birth this year myself, that has really resonated with me as a powerful metaphor for this time. This idea of growing things inside of ourselves in darkness. And then this idea of laboring. So I've been thinking a lot about my work these days as laboring, and how that allows for this simultaneous experience of pain and agony, and also joy and ecstasy, and just like the miracle of creating something out of nothing. And that's the work that we're called to do right now, is to labor. And as a new mom, I think that kind of idea has really just resonated a lot for me. And on that note, come in. Here's little Lucy.
Hi, Lucy.
Oh my gosh. Thanks for joining. Thank you for joining us, Lucy. We appreciate your input into this conversation. Oh my gosh.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Lucy, for making time in your busy schedule. I know the schedule of
it
newborns.
Is busy. It is busy.
Very busy. But Christine, thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Thank you, Christine. This has been a really fascinating conversation. We really appreciate your time.
That's a wrap on the interview, but the conversation continues.
And we want to hear from you. Send your questions, comments, ideas, and suggestions to justdigital.hbs.edu.
You've been watching Pathways to a Just Digital Future,
an investigative project that aims to better understand and address inequality in tech.
This program was produced by the Harvard Business School Digital and Gender Initiatives.
Our team includes
Ethiopia Omari and my cat.
Tanya Flint.
One more time. Liz Sarli.
Thomas Jamie-dayo.
I'm Dave Homa.
And I'm Colleen Ammerman.
Thanks for hanging out with us.
Keep exploring at justdigital.hbs.edu.